Thanks for watching live or listening back to this show from Teachers Talk Radio. You can catch up with all our shows by visiting our YouTube channel or by listening back at ttradio.org. Don't forget to like and subscribe to enjoy more live education conversation from TTR. We hope you enjoy this show.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio for this one-off show from me looking at isolation in schools. And welcome to everybody watching this. It's great to have you with us. This, I think, is our 7th show of the week. There's been a heck of a lot going on at TTR. If you want to check out the other shows, then just head over to ttradio.org, check them out. Follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you listen or watch, then that's where you need to go. Anyway, it's great to be here tonight to talk about this very contentious issue of isolation in schools and I suppose also exclusion in schools. So there were people asking the question, are isolation rooms damaging for students? And if they are, then should they be done away with? There's other people saying they're an absolute necessity, that without them, the system falls apart. The behaviour management systems in schools falls apart. There's some on one side saying that isolation rooms cause students to feel less belonging to a school, less part of the school community. They don't help students to, if you like, learn from their mistakes. And on the other side, there's people saying, well, we don't like the term isolation rooms. We're going to be speaking to a couple of people who I'll introduce in a moment about this, but there'll be people who are saying, we don't like the term isolation rooms, we prefer removal rooms. And those people obviously feel that these removal rooms are absolutely essential for teachers as part of the toolkit of managing behaviours in schools, especially now. So that's the picture of why this show has come about. And I've got two interviewees. I've got Emma Clarke, who is going to be talking about this. And I've also got Tom Bennett. So two people, I don't want to speak for them, who have very different views on this and very different views on the idea of isolation rooms in schools. And that's really what we're all about at Teachers Talk Radio, is bringing different views to the table from across the profession. So we're going to hear first, and unfortunately I had to pre-record these interviews for this show, so these interviews aren't live. But if you do have a comment, please leave one on YouTube, on X, on LinkedIn, wherever you end up watching this or listening back to it. Please, share your thoughts. That's what it's all about. Love to hear them. But yeah, they're two interviews. First one with Tom Bennett and the second one with Emma Clarke. So enjoy them and let me know your thoughts, and we'll pick this one up after the interview with Tom Bennett, and then pick it up again at the end of the show. So see you in a bit. I wanted to catch up with you around a recent report that was published around isolation in schools, which has drawn a lot of debate, commentary. I wanted to ask you, Tom, first off the bat, actually, do you ever get wound up by any of the comments made to you on social media?
Never. Not anymore. Not since about 2019. Because it's happened too often. And if you let it get to you, it will drive you mad. And it's one of the unhealthiest places to be for the human mind, is connected to the hive mind. So you have to curate, block, and make sure that anyone who's abusing you or being a bit nuts with you, just keep them out your life. You wouldn't let them in your front door. So,
Sure.
why let them into your head, I think is good curation. But it's so hard for kids, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so kind of against kids having too much of access to smartphones and social media simply because it is overwhelming, and I'm pretty tough, and it can sometimes niggle you, but I try to
Yeah.
rise above it.
Yeah. I mean, this one, the reason I asked that is because this one got quite spicy. I mean, even in
Did
the
it?
days of post, well, in the context of post Elon Musk Twitter, it did. You know, probably like 5 years ago, this would have been like, you know, much bigger. But anyway,
Yeah. Well, can I just say, so just I have to put it so. See, people often talk about, you know, how bad things got when Musk took over, and don't get me wrong. I mean, it is full of
yeah,
it's full of mentalists and Nazis now,
Mm.
and that's probably not a good thing. But but I see no difference between the level of kind of attacks that I got then and now. I
Mm.
think that people think that Twitter was a lovely place 5 or 6 years ago because there weren't so many people on it and they weren't themselves being picked up and stuff. I've always felt it to be a hostile's too strong a word, but in a place where I have to be cautious. But anyway, that's a digression.
Yeah, spicy. No, I get it. I get it. Okay, so this report, it came out maybe 3 weeks ago now, and it said it was the first study of prevalence, inequalities, and outcomes of the disciplinary practice of isolation rooms in
Oh, was
secondary
it now?
school.
So they'd like to think.
And in this analysis, it mentions 121 mainstream schools in Manchester, and it says that 8.3% of pupils reported being internally excluded at least once a week for an average of 8.44 hours per week. So one of the conclusions here is that this Be Well study suggested that internal exclusion is, quote, very widely used and may be, quote, discriminatory and harmful. So from
Right.
your experience in advising schools and working with schools, does this match what you see on the ground, or does it paint an unfair picture of how isolation is actually used?
That's beautifully put. I'm going to begin by saying, and I think the other commentator said this too, I completely reject the term isolation room. I really do. I think it already seeds ground to people that hate them. And that the vast majority of people who are massively set against these rooms are people who've never ever worked in a challenging school environment. I mean, that's the first thing. I call them removal rooms because the purpose of these spaces isn't to isolate a student, it's to remove them. That's the purpose of it. It's not like, oh, that student really needs to be isolated. It's more like that student needs to be taken away from an environment which they are making hostile for other people. Now, here's the first thing is, I've been to a lot of schools. I mean, I bang on about this, but I mean, I have been to a lot of schools. I've been to about 1,500 schools now. And it doesn't make me any better than anyone else, but I have seen a lot of schools, right? Good and bad, mostly in the UK. And removal rooms are very common. They're not ubiquitous, they're not everywhere, but they are very, very common because it is absolutely blindingly obvious to any school where the behaviour is, you know, even slightly less than perfect, that occasionally a student might need to be taken out of the classroom because their mucking around is making it impossible for other children to learn, or make it dangerous, or they're being hostile or racist or misogynistic, you know, things that we're supposed to care a lot about, right? You know, safety and misogyny and so on, things that, you know, people often stroke their chins and say, oh, this really matters, you know, we're very much against these things. But if you allow a child to persist in that behaviour in the classroom, wrecking the education of other children, threatening their lives, maybe that's a bit strong, but, you know, threatening their safety, and threatening their dignity, then that child needs to be taken out of the classroom. Well, I mean, the people who campaign against this, I feel like I'm taking crazy pills when I even think about this. What do they expect people to do? Just let these kids stay in the classroom? It's absolutely bonkers. So what we do is we take them to another room, which I'm going to call the removal room, where other things will then happen with them, right? That's removal. Isolation is, I mean, isolation has the connotations of, you know, they're by themselves and so on. These students are almost always with other students who've also been removed for these reasons, and always with another adult. You know, you cannot leave a child alone by themselves in a classroom. That's a safeguard nightmare. So I think it's completely not what people say it is. The second thing, and I'm on a roll here, Tom, so stop me if you want.
Yeah, no,
The
go.
second thing I'll say is, this is why you got me. The second thing is that the numbers quoted in the study are completely nonsense. The They're claiming that, you know, 1 in 8 kids spend more than a day a week in isolation or in removal rooms. I mean, that's just a nonsense. I've never seen anything even approaching that. People like, you know, renowned edu bloggers like Andrew Smith have done the number crunching on this, and it just seems completely daft to even presume this. You'd have to have rooms stuffed with kids all day long for that to happen, and I've never seen that. And I've seen more schools than probably most people have. I would also suggest this is probably an example of what is referred to as the lizard man effect. That when you you know, when you give a study to a large enough number of people, then some people will just enter silly answers, and it's about 4 or 5%. You know, so if you say to someone what the age is on a national census, you know, some people will write that their age is 150 or something, just to be daft, just to be, you know, controversial. I imagine with kids, it's probably much more than that. So I'm going to suggest that a lot of this is the lizard man effect, or a lot of people not understanding what we mean by isolation or removal and so on. So that's so I think the numbers are rubbish, and they should be ashamed of them.
Do you
quite
think that there's a point though where, I mean, what's the point in your view where whether you call it a removal room, isolation room, whatever you call that room,
Yeah,
is
the
there
nexus
a point?
of torment.
Is there a point in your view where it can tip into overuse, and where is that point?
Well, I
because
mean,
obviously it's an
the-
issue for some that they'd say any use is overuse, but
I mean, to an extent, I find I'm not sure that question is as important as it might sound, because there is an excess and a deficiency of anything. You know, if someone said to you, you should drink some water, well, you can drink too much water and you can drink not enough water. Absolutely true. You know, I mean, kids should be removed from the classroom when their behavior is making it impossible for other people to learn, when there's a serious assault or affront to other people's dignity or their safety or their mental health or their well-being, then that's obviously going to be contestable and challengeable on many levels. But that's roughly where I stand in this. You know, if I can't teach a lesson because of disruption, or if a kid's told me to F off, or someone else to F off, gone. Gone from the room. You do not do that in a classroom. It's a place of learning and thinking and tolerance and safety. Then they get taken somewhere else. And that taken somewhere else is A, for them to think about, for them to have a good long think about what they've done, but also B, to maybe even calm down because they might be upset or angry or frustrated with something. And then C, for us to then think, right, what's going to happen next? And what's going to happen next will normally be some kind of sanction. The removal isn't itself a sanction. The removal is simply a strategy to keep people safe. I mean, when the students in that room, they should also receive some form of education. They should be given work to do, for example. And if people say, oh, well, that's not as good as a classroom, then my response is, well, they shouldn't have had themselves removed from the classroom in the first place. You know, they gave themselves that consequence. So I just think it's such an essential thing to do. And some people say, oh, well, can't you take them into another classroom? Parking. I mean, I really don't think parking works at all. All parking does is it disrupts somebody else's lesson. And the kid sits there, you know, thinking, well, I got out of the lesson I wanted to get out of. So it doesn't serve any purpose whatsoever, especially not pastoral.
There was a recent blog written by a head teacher called Hannah Carter in TES, and I know you tweeted about it a couple of weeks ago. And she basically said that, you know, they got rid of isolation in her school. She said that for isolation, it provides an immediate, the common argument for isolation is it provides an immediate consequence for poor behavior, breathing space, and a deterrent. But I see isolation as a strategy of avoidance, effectively warehousing disruption rather than solving it. It doesn't work in fostering long-term positive change.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I'm sure she's a fine person. This isn't a personal dig at Hannah or her, I'm sure, fine school, but that just doesn't make sense to me, because later on in the article, it reveals that they do have a place where they take students who muck around, but they call it,
Yeah.
I forget what they call
It
it.
says, after removing our isolation room, we introduced a new system that had a clear escalating structure of support, and it was called they enter a crisis and intervention hub.
There you go.
Staffed by
there you go.
highly trained mentors.
They've called it something else. They've called it the crisis and intervention hub. You know, and I just say the vast majority of removal rooms I see, I've got people who really care about the kids and really want them to do well and ask them what happened and ask them what went wrong. But we'll also have kind of some form of, right, now you got to sit there and be quiet for a little while. And at the end of the day, we'll decide what we're going to do. And the vast majority of schools that do removal rooms will have some kind of triage principle whereby they think, right, what's going on with this kid? Now, 9 times out of 10, what this kid needs is some kind of sanction to say, don't do that again. In the same way that you would give somebody a parking fine for parking in the wrong space. You know, you did this, so you get that. It's meant to be a disincentive. If you do it again, it'll be worse for you. And if you do it again a lot, then we start to look at, reasons for, what's going on here, and is there something else we can do? And also, we want the child to feel.
But do you think that's happening in isolation rooms? That bit is that?
Well, not always in the isolation room, but usually at the end of the day. I mean, the thing is, it varies so much from school to school. So for some schools I've seen, when the kid gets removed, they get taken to a kind of a triage destination. This is great, where they'll be kind of semi-interviewed by somebody to say, what's happened? Tell me in your words what's happened. Now, they'll still have to be taken to the removal room. That doesn't get rescinded, but that person then starts to think, oh, is there something going on at home? Or is this kid just being rude? Kids are rude sometimes, and children can be rude, and teachers deserve to be protected from that, and so do their peers. So I think what we don't do is we make the mistake of thinking, well, if they've been removed from the classroom, they must be exhibiting some kind of deep-seated mental trauma. Very frequent, what they're just doing is exhibiting deep-seated personality disorders, and when it's just that, then they need to have some kind of deterrent.
Going back to the report a second, it highlights in the report, they say that the rooms are used in a disproportionate way for boys, older pupils, LGBTQ plus students, SEND students, FSM eligible students, people premium, and minoritized ethnic groups.
Right.
So how would you how would you interpret those disparities that they found?
That's a good question. There's loads to dig into there. So number one, people often talk about the risk factors for being excluded or suspended or receiving any kind of in-school sanction. The two biggest risk factors for receiving them, or the two biggest markers or indicators, the two biggest things that correlate, are being a boy and being a bit older, right? It's mostly boys and mostly older boys that get in trouble at school, right? So I don't know what you want to do with that. Do you want to deliberately suspend more girls? Right, or fewer boys? There's no way to get around that, and the reason why boys are mucking around more is probably something to do with testosterone and bulk and body mass and all kinds of sex differences, right? So there's that, or societal expectations of sex differences, right? Whatever you want to put it. So there's that. So I don't think that's disproportionate. I think that's very much the norm. And I think complaining about that is a very odd thing to do, and it's the kind of thing that only a person who doesn't work in a school would say. And secondly, the DfE doesn't collect the data about children who are suspended, excluded, or isolated in terms of whether they're LGBT or whatever, which means that this is very much a self-report from the school. And again, I would take this very much with a pinch of salt. And also I would ask some really significant questions. I mean, do we genuinely think that people are being removed from classrooms because they're gay? I'd be very surprised with that, and I think that needs a lot more substantiation. In terms of ethnicity, again, this is very much self-report, so it's very hard to see what that is and what that stands for.
I mean, commentary online was suggesting. Sorry, Tom, go on.
When it comes to suspensions and exclusions, for example, this is often something which is discussed, the disproportionality, but you actually find that in the UK, for example, white British tend to be excluded slightly more than black British. So I don't think ethnicity is really the driving factor here, and I think maybe it looks like the writers of this report are kind of looking for it rather than actually finding it.
And I think commentary online did sort of speculate on the reasons for it. So they mentioned things like the critics. I mean, not the critics, the people who supported the report were suggesting it could have been discrimination, maybe, or it could have been structural factors that make certain students more likely to display behaviours warranting isolation.
Yeah, I think that's rubbish. I just don't think they've proven that in any sense whatsoever. I think it's a very common thing for people to say with a very strong axe to grind, but there's just no evidence to suggest that whatsoever.
Do you think when it comes to sense, you mentioned older boys, which I get, on the SEND students, if they are, and I understand what you've just said in terms of the report itself and some of the issues you flagged up about it for you, but if SEND students are spending longer or are being in isolation longer than other students,
in removal, Tom, in removal
room, sorry, does that mean that schools or teachers or the system needs a rethink?
No. I'll tell you why I think that, because one of the biggest I mean, again, the data presented in this report is really weak and poor, so I don't like to rely on it particularly much at all. I don't really think there is a good study of removal rooms that's been done, and certainly not this one. But I lean back into things like suspensions and exclusions, where we've got a lot of data. And you know, for example, we find that SEND absolutely is very highly prevalent in things like suspensions and exclusions. But one of the main reasons for that is because of SEMH. Now, SEMH category of SEND is itself the kind of classification you can achieve when your behavior is very poor. So let me just lay that out, you know, clearly for the listeners, which is that if you behave really badly at school, it's quite likely you'll end up with an assignation of an SEND because your behavior is so poor. So they must be so good. But I find that weirdly circular. So I'd be extremely surprised if SEND wasn't disproportionately represented in the figures of people who receive some kind of in-school exclusion, sanctions, or suspensions, simply because misbehavior is more prevalent in that category. Because SEND should not and does not mean bad behavior. And bad behavior doesn't mean SEND, but unfortunately it can lead you to that assignation. So I'd just like to be really clear of that. Children with ASD and ADHD, for example, are suspended and excluded at pretty much the same rates as all other children. In fact, children with ASD even seems to be a protecting factor against exclusions and suspensions. So I'd be very surprised if that wasn't mapped out also in the in-school sections like removals and so on.
Sure. In the report, they also mention that they lower the sense of belonging that students feel. And they also mentioned in the report that they worsen relationships with staff, and they can affect the well-being of children negatively.
Yeah.
And anything on, I mean, the bit about belonging, any thoughts on that? Because
Yeah.
what I know in that blog as well by Hannah Carter, she actually mentioned this as well. She said the act of removal it's an act of removal and rejection that tells the student they're not safe or valued within the learning community.
Yeah,
is how she framed it in her blog.
Well, you'll know this as well as anyone else, Tom. You know, when a pupil walks up to you and says, "Go F yourself," or pushes somebody over in the classroom, or calls someone the N-word, you know, chucks a bag at them, and then they feel sad because they don't feel like they belong in the class anymore. I'm really sorry. I genuinely have a kind of unconditional regard for all the people I ever teach or ever have taught, but that doesn't mean that I have to automatically feel a kind of Olympian level of empathy when they complain because they've received a consequence for their actions. You know, as you sow shall you reap. And I think that, you know, that if a child goes to a removal room and feels a bit sad about it, well, then that should maybe cause pause for thought as to why they're feeling sad and what they've done to maybe get them there, and maybe take some responsibility for that. And I think that the interesting thing is that in the good removal rooms, there are a chance for kids to still receive a form of continued education. There's still somebody looking after them. They're still cared for. It's just that they themselves have removed themselves from the best, most nurturing place in the school, which is the classroom, where they can learn and thrive and flourish and develop with other people, with their comrades and allies. But they've removed themselves from that situation. And the teachers had to facilitate that for the safety of the majority, or for the sanity of the majority. And I don't think that's unfair. So I think there's that they're putting the cart before the horse here. That if they wanted to feel like they belonged, then they wouldn't behave in such ways which remove them from that sense of belonging.
If you removed isolation rooms tomorrow from every school in England, what do you think would realistically happen?
Well, I mean, I know exactly what would happen because I go to schools all the time that don't have them. If you went to an even averagely challenging school and there wasn't a place to send students, they would be in the corridor, right? Which is one of the worst of all possible worlds, because they're not learning, they're not supervised, they're not being cared for, they can do what they please, they can interfere with other people. You know, you've just thrown them out of the system. That's worse than anything else. They're going to be parked in someone else's classroom, which again is completely suboptimal, or they're going to remain in the classroom. after they've done something so dreadful that normally you'd be thinking this person has to go. Which means that the victims of their abuse, their bullying, their intimidation, their disruption, their chaos, have to suffer and endure more of it. Children look at us as if we are mad when we don't remove students who do stuff like this. You know, and I've been in lots of situations where the teacher hasn't removed a kid who's been really rude to the teacher, and some of the kids say, "Sir, why don't you send them out?" And it makes them think that we are weak and that we can't look after them, and it makes them feel scared. It's a complete abdication of responsibility. And I feel like I'm on Bizarro World even having to justify this. Because when you're in a classroom with a kid who's fighting somebody else, or who's threatening somebody else, or has told you to F off, they cannot remain in that classroom. Nobody should be expected to put up with that, least of all the rest of the children, whom you have a duty to protect as well.
What if a student keeps going into the room? Do you see things any different now, or is that more, you know, you have your escalating sanctions, eventually
Keep
could
going
be
into the removal
exclusion,
room.
or yeah.
Yeah. Well, to be honest, it's more like, you know, it's like, what if somebody keeps getting parking tickets? You don't go, "Oh, well, the parking tickets aren't working. We better stop giving them parking tickets." You keep giving them parking tickets. And at the same time, if somebody is exhibiting recidivist, repeat offending behavior in a school, then you also make the response more complex as well. But you don't take away that vital mechanism, which one of which main roots is to protect the rest of the people in the classroom from that behavior. So if they keep getting sent there, well, then that's a sign for us to say this person is really displaying really bad behavior. You don't think, well, our systems aren't working. Schools aren't magic. I mean, we teach everybody. We teach everybody. Even we teach psychopaths and sociopaths. We teach people with borderline personality disorders. We teach cruel people. We teach racist people. We teach violent people. We teach people who end up in prison. We teach people who end up in Westminster. Pick your poison. But the point is this: we teach them all. Read into that what you will. We teach them all. And the fact that we can't magically fix all of their behavioral problems doesn't mean we've failed. And I feel very strongly about this. No other profession is expected to manage behavior perfectly. Doctors aren't expected to cure everybody. Lawyers don't, and police officers don't catch everybody. In schools, we do what we can with the resources that we have, but we deal with everybody. And you can have a team of psychiatrists and social workers, and some kids will still say, "I'm going to set the fire alarm off." So you have to be really careful about what we take away. I'm reminded of Chesterton's fence, the idea that you don't take a fence away until you know what it's for. And one of the things that we need in classrooms and schools is some kind of safety valve where the children whose behavior exceeds the capacity of a teacher to handle it. And let's face it, that happens a lot. I mean, I was good with kids, but I couldn't magically make them all behave. If a kid wanted to tell me to F off, he was going to do it. So you need somewhere for that child to be then taken. It's as clear as the nose in my face. And anyone that doesn't see that hasn't worked in a challenging school or hasn't worked in a challenging school successfully. Back to the reset.
Is there a minimum? So if you were looking at national standards for these rooms, right? Are there any do's or don'ts in your opinion, or any minimum standards or whatever that you think should apply across the board?
Sure. I would balk at launching some kind of minimum standard, given that I advise the DFE on this kind of stuff. I'd be very careful what I say here. I don't think there should be a national set of, thou shalts. I mean, even the behaviour guidance for schools is non-mandatory, right? I think that I'm very happy to see guidelines, but more just professional guidelines, like the room should be staffed, but then they always are. The student when they enter the room should be provided work to do, which I don't think I've ever seen that not happen. It's a statutory requirement that we provide an education. Typically, they often don't do it. But then that's very much on them by this point. So I'm not really sure what the guidelines would include in that. I think the students should receive an education or be provided with it. I think that at the end of the day, there should also be a threshold conversation with the student where it's clearly pointed out to them what they did to get there, what they should have done, what they need to do in the future, what's going to happen next. But also, yes, we care about you. We want you to do well. We want you to be better. The reason they're in the room isn't because we hate them. The reason they're in the room is because they put themselves there. But we'd rather they were in the room with us, learning and growing. So you have to have that conversation. That's normally quite a skilled conversation to have about, you matter to me. We value you. We hope you do better. but you didn't do very well today, but we know you can do better. That kind of conversation where you retain their dignity at the same time as holding them to account for their actions is quite complex. And somebody needs to be trained to do that, but you need to have that room. And they also need to know that it's not a good place to be, that they shouldn't be there, that they've done something wrong. And my suggestion would be that in addition to the removal, there should be a significant sanction on top of it. The removal isn't the sanction. The removal should be all day, because the student has removed themselves from school. That's a big deal. We don't take that lightly. We don't return them after 20 minutes. We keep them there all day. And at the end of the day, they should do a sanction. But the room isn't the sanction itself. The room's not a punishment. You know, the room is meant to be well, we had to put you here because we couldn't keep you there.
Final question, Tom. Provocative one. If
they're all provocative, Tom. Which ones haven't been provocative?
I'm trying my best. If the practice is, as you say, effective and fair, why then do you think that a lot of young people and families, particularly in maybe more vulnerable groups, let's say, report negative experiences of it? Why do they sort of say this? Why do they often cite, you know, being in one of these rooms when they talk about a negative experience of school?
Yeah, I mean, I always feel like this is a rhetorical question, Tom. So I'm just going to play a straight bat on this question. You know, why don't kids like getting in trouble? Why don't people like the consequences of their actions? Why don't people want to take responsibility for their actions, particularly if they've already exhibited chaotic behavior that they feel they are blameless for? Why do people see themselves as the center of the universe? Why do people forgive themselves for things that other people do and they wouldn't let them off with quite so easily? You know, I mean, I feel like this is the heart of human nature, that when you give somebody you know, why don't people like parking tickets? You know, oh, that was really unfair. I was only doing 3 miles above the speed limit, that kind of thing. You know, why do chaotic people fail to appreciate that sometimes warm, safe, nurturing environments require structural boundaries with consequences? I mean, sometimes they don't grasp that, and I get it, but I'm not surprised they don't grasp it.
Tom, thank you ever so much for your time.
Tom, my pleasure. It's been too long.
Good conversation. Yeah. So that was Tom Bennett talking about isolation rooms in schools. This is a great opportunity and little segue for me to mention our sponsors on the show this evening. They are Hachette Learning. If you haven't heard of Hachette Learning, formerly John Catt Educational, they are publishers of professional development books and resources for teachers around the world. They publish lots of teacher authors on their website. So just visit them at Hachette Learning. You can see the range of titles they have available. Absolutely spectacular range of CPD titles for teachers who are trying to get that professional development to improve their practice. So thank you, Hachette, for supporting and sponsoring Teachers Talk Radio, of course. And the second thing I wanted to mention was in January 21st to 23rd at Excel London, we have the Bet Show. Teachers Talk Radio will be there. We can't wait. The team will be there. Please visit us at our stand if you are attending. If you're not attending, go and get your teacher ticket now at the Bet Show website. The tickets are free for current teachers and school leaders. So head over there, check it out. Anyway, on to the second half of the show. We've now got Emma Clarke, who I again spoke to about this report that's come out to get her views on it. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us again. This time I'm joined by Emma Clarke. Emma, do you want to just introduce yourself really briefly to listeners out there at Teachers Talk Radio?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name's Emma Clarke. I was a primary school teacher for the best part of 20 years, and I've been working in university-based teacher education for just over 10 years. And I'm particularly interested in researching girls' experiences in secondary schools and sort of behaviour and exclusion more widely.
Okay, perfect. So let's kick off then with a wider question, wider thoughts then, Emma. What are your thoughts on, because we've been talking in this show about isolation booths, and I was speaking with Tom Bennett in another segment of this, and he was saying that they shouldn't really be called isolation rooms, they should be called removal rooms instead of isolation rooms. Do you have a view on the use of isolation rooms in general in secondary or primary schools?
I think the semantic differences are the least of our concerns, really. I don't think the main issue is what we call them, whether we call them isolation rooms, whether we call them intervention rooms, support rooms, exclusion rooms, sin bins. You know, I think that the terminology is kind of masking the issue of their use, full stop, really. So to me, the concern is not whether we should rename them or, you know, have a kind of a themed name for them. It's the use of them in themselves, I think, is problematic, not what we call them. I think it's the function of them that is the issue, not the naming.
Sure. And we're focusing in this conversation on a recent report, the Be Well study,
Yeah.
which suggested that isolation was A, widely used, and B, potentially harmful. So from
Yeah.
your perspective, does this study confirm what you already believe, or did it surprise you in any way?
No, it totally confirmed it. And it highlights some really, really interesting issues. And for me, those mirror issues around exclusion more widely, which is the fact that it's largely unregulated. There are only certain sorts of exclusions that are regulated by the DfE, that are reported to the DfE. And these internal exclusions, removal rooms, or however you want to call them, are part of this kind of hinterland of unregulated, non-described, sort of set out, just the vague grey area of exclusions. And it's that unregulated nature that I think is hugely problematic. And that's something this study points out really, really well, I think, and highlights that we are doing something to young people that there is no research evidence for, and that everybody is doing it slightly differently. And we talk about removal rooms, isolation rooms, internal exclusion, whatever you want to call it, as a kind of defined thing that we all know what we're talking about. But the report highlights, as is my own research and understanding, that actually they're used really, really differently and fulfill a very different purpose in different schools. But I think what is really interesting about the report, and I'm pointing down here because I've got it next to me, is thinking about those long-term implications, but also pointing out that the use of internal isolation rooms really mirror those longer-term results around exclusion. So they're talking again in this study about isolation rooms being disproportionately used, having significant impacts on certain groups of our children, and actually just starting that marginalisation from education earlier, which I think is hugely concerning and worrying.
What do you mean by the marginalisation element there?
So in these rooms, you are obviously physically separating groups of pupils out from their peers. And one of the key functions of schooling is to develop that sense of belonging, to develop that sense of social cohesion, to develop that ability to work together, to be present in the same room and experience the same teaching. And if you are physically removing a group of pupils for whatever reason, you are excluding them from that main teaching cohort and you are giving them something other. So whether that provision is particular intervention or an exclusion room sitting by themselves somewhere, you are physically marginalising them because they're being removed from the rest of the group, from their friends, from their peers, and you're also marginalising them in terms of their sense of belonging. So for that period where they're in that isolation room, they are temporarily not part of the rest of the school culture. They're not having their usual teachers, they're not experiencing the usual school day. So they're marginalised socially and academically. And this study points out, which is echoed in lots of other research, that really impacts on children's and pupils' sense of belonging to a school. It impacts on the relationships they form with their peers. It impacts on the relationships they form with teachers. And that's the kind of social glue that keeps our children in school. So you're starting to chip away at that sort of social glue by separating out a group of individuals who statistically are likely to find education more challenging. So you're starting to chip away earlier than some of the more formal interventions.
Okay, so in this context, what is your sort of alternative take on what should happen, given the example you've just given of what you think the consequences of removal or isolation are?
That's where it gets really difficult. So it isn't a kind of black and white, oh, they should be in, they should be out. The use of isolation rooms or its internal exclusion is like a flare to me from the system saying that actually something's really wrong. And that isn't fixed by saying, oh, we should change one element of our education system and all of these children who struggle will fit back in. So I think it's really difficult to say, oh, I'd just do this and that would remove the use for internal isolation. It's really bound up in lots and lots of other issues. So we've got really different aspects that are impacting on education. And I think the use of removal is like a symptom of all of those other issues. So if we think about the issues around teacher recruitment and retention, we're struggling in some schools, in some areas, to staff schools with consistent staff. So we have a lot of movement in some schools, don't we? Staff join and they leave really quickly. So you've got that challenge of getting to know the children, of developing experience, of developing those relationships as a teacher. That's one element that I think contributes to the use of isolation rooms. We've then got issues around children with additional needs, with SEND, with SEMH, which is another contributing factor to the use of isolation rooms. So this Be Well study and other studies have highlighted that it tends to be children with a particular SEND who experience more of this isolation. We know from statistics, from experience in schools, that we've got more children with particular SENDs in mainstream education. We've also got challenges in terms of funding. So funding in school is really, really difficult at the minute, and that includes things like schools funding alternative provisions, schools funding pupils in pupil referral units. So it's not just, oh, I think we should do this and this will resolve it. I think the isolation rooms have come about as part of a cluster of challenges that are affecting schools. So I don't think there is one thing we can do. I think it really needs to be a multi-pronged, long-term effort to improve teacher retention, to improve teacher recruitment, to improve funding for schools. And also,
does that suggest, correct me if I'm wrong, does that suggest in your sort of estimation that it's more to do with the teaching and the relationships those teachers forge as to why students are being removed?
Yes, but I don't think it is the teacher's fault, if that makes sense. So I think there is an issue in terms of relationship building. And I think in some schools that's the transience of staff for a range of reasons. But I also think schools are under enormous pressure academically to ensure they hit the targets that they have been set. And we know that if you are not meeting targets as a school, there are a range of implications for the whole school and for individual teachers. So I think teachers are working in a real sort of hothouse of pressure. You are being pushed really hard to achieve academic targets for your children, for the young people in front of you. And I think that's another reason why, for some schools in particular, there is an additional use of things like isolation rooms. So the Be Well study highlights really interestingly that schools with high suspension and exclusion rates also have higher use of internal isolation rooms. So there is a theme here about removing learners who impact on schools' ability to achieve the results that they need. That's one strand. It's not the only strand, but it is another element that feeds into that use of isolation rooms. So it's not
when you say the results they need, in what respect do you mean that?
So in terms of internal targets, particularly in multi-academy trusts, where there tends to be higher exclusion rates, particularly in some trusts, but also progress 8 figures in terms of things like drop in results triggering Ofsted. But we're also in a really marketised state with our schools, aren't we? Where there is a big push on parental choice, which in itself is not wrong, but it has led to schools selling themselves to parents on a range of different factors. And one of the indicators is what are my children's school results like? Is it a good school in terms of, if I send my children there, are they likely to get good GCSEs, good A levels, make good progress? So there is that additional push, that additional pressure on schools to be marketable, to look like a good school, to keep your customers coming in, to keep your pupils coming in.
But do you think that, I mean, again, the critics of what you're saying will say, well, yeah, the exam results of all students are really important because that's their futures. But by saying that, you know, I mean, let's put it in a more granular level, go back to what we're talking about, because I understand what you're saying about systemic issues. I get it, right? But fundamentally, you know, tomorrow, or not tomorrow because it's Sunday, but on Monday, there's going to be lots of teachers in classrooms with 25, 30 students in secondary and primary schools around the country. And if there are behavior issues in that class that the teacher can't resolve within the class, what are you saying they should do? What are you saying the school and the teacher should do? So as an alternative to removal and isolation, in very practical terms, what should be happening instead?
I'm going to swerve that question because I don't think it is that simple. I will come back to it after swerving it. So in terms of, like, if I was back in school on Monday and I had a child who was incredibly disruptive, what would I do? Yeah, I might temporarily send them out to another classroom. So in terms of primary, the isolation room system is not as common as in secondary, but it's absolutely common if you've got a child who is really, really challenging, who is disrupting learning, to temporarily send them out to another room. So there is not a quick fix that's going to happen on Monday. There is not.
So that is isolation, though, isn't it? In that sense, yeah. So you're not against isolation.
I am against long-term isolation. I accept in the system that we are operating in that some settings need to use it. My concern is long-term. So it is not an issue that is going to be solved by Monday. It isn't, teachers, come on, don't do this. It's really straightforward. Do something else. There isn't a quick fix answer. And that's what I find really frustrating about this dialogue, is that it becomes really, really polarized. And people are like, yes, we need to have these isolation rooms. They're absolutely essential. And then other people are saying, no, you shouldn't have them. And I'm more firmly on the no, you shouldn't have them side. But it is not a quick fix. It is, like you said before, it's part of a really complex problem. And we have kind of we are resorting to using these isolation rooms to fix problems that need fixing, if that makes sense. So I think the isolation room use is a result of other problems in education, not simply the fact that teachers can't cope with children's behaviour. So,
if in an ideal world, I'm again, I don't want to paraphrase you, so correct me if I'm wrong here in what I'm saying, but from everything you said so far, I think in an ideal world, you wouldn't want there to be removal or isolation rooms in schools.
Yeah.
So what if that was the case and there wasn't any?
Yeah.
What do you think the results of that would be in schools?
Tomorrow, on Monday, it would be really, really difficult and it would be really chaotic. So you need to transition away from isolation rooms whilst other things are put in place. So the report that's come out about the use of internal isolation rooms suggests some really brilliant things that my findings have also supported and that is supported by wider research. So things like encouraging the use of social emotional skills, working on projects that encourage pupils' belonging in school. But that's not going to be done by Monday lunchtime. So you need that transition. You need to, I would argue, that it would be really important to transition away from isolation rooms, but also have things in place to support those children who would have been isolated. So we're not in a kind of a, by Monday lunchtime, we need to stop isolation. But it is a crisis reaction, I think, that echoes the crisis that we're experiencing more widely in education. But the use of, social emotional development programs for young people, the schools working on including children, that sense of belonging. These are not quick fixes. These are not, well, I'll just do this intervention and all my children are going to be really happy. But when you look at what research suggests is the long-term repercussions of internal isolation, that just screams to me that we have to start chipping away at this system that is not serving our pupils and is not serving our schools.
Do you think the behaviours that are being exhibited, because obviously we've seen a lot of surveys, in the last few years that all pretty much unanimously show that teachers and school leaders are witnessing lowering, I don't know how to paraphrase it, lowering behavior standards, more problems with behavior, more challenging behaviors, more this, more that. So again, from what you're saying, what are you putting that down to?
Again, it's really not the answer that anybody wants to hear, but it's really complicated, isn't it? It's not one single factor that has resulted in that. So there's lots of research that suggests that children have really struggled to return from the impacts of COVID, from the isolation, that, the impact of social media, the curriculum in schools not necessarily being fit for purpose for some of our children, the wider workforce having changed. I think it's an issue of a lot of things, particularly access to specialist provision, which is full in a lot of places and is also really, really expensive. So it's not one thing that has changed pupils' behaviour. I think it is a reaction to a lot of different things that is causing a change in behaviour. And I think schools are in a position where they are really struggling to react and support these behaviours because of funding, because of everything else.
One thing that you didn't mention, though, in your list, and again, this is maybe where critics would come in and say, well, what about sort of individual responsibility? What about sort of the lack of respect? What about lack of basic manners? What about lack of appreciation for others or respect for others, or just being able to behave in ways that maybe in the past would have been seen as completely, sort of the most fundamental ways of, of human behavior, or the lack of care, sense of entitlement, all of these things, you're saying they're all to do with, the schools, the system, the teachers, the curriculum, things not supporting? Or are you saying, like, actually, no, some of this is just on the kids and the parents and the environment and what they're doing? So what I'm talking about is who, from everything you've said, again, correct me, a lot of it is sort of about support, right? So, you've mentioned the word support a lot, which is fine. But I'm saying, all of those things I've just mentioned, sometimes, it isn't about, any of the things you've just mentioned. It's just about young people not, having that sort of those boundaries and and the sanctions to go with it, and understanding that this thing's okay and this thing's not okay.
And I wouldn't argue there isn't a place for that, but I would also encourage people to think about the changes in children's home circumstances and young people's home circumstances. So the increase of children living in poverty and absolute poverty since COVID has skyrocketed. And that's something we hear about more widely in the media, about the crisis of, cost of living crisis. But I think it's really difficult for a child to understand boundaries and be polite if they are coming from a background of not having a warm home or electricity at home to do their homework. And again, it's really reductive to say, oh, all children should be, we shouldn't have any sanctions because children are having a really tough time, to saying, actually, they're rude. It's entirely on the child. Culture's changed, and we need to crack down on that. I'm not at either end of that spectrum, and I don't think either is right. But I think education and dialogue about education is becoming more polarised in that kind of, we've got to crack down, they're really rude and lazy too. Oh, it should all be about therapeutic care. Now, I'm probably more on one end of that spectrum than another. But I think, yes, schools need to support children in understanding boundaries, and we need to model that. I think if children aren't experiencing boundaries at home, if they haven't got care, if they haven't got warmth, support and love, I don't know if simply sanctioning a child is going to bridge that gap. So, I'm saying there is a place for sanctioning. But if I think about some of the children that I taught and the backgrounds that they came from and the challenges they had, me saying that was really rude, get out, come back in 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, wherever, I don't know if that begins to address anything. So yes, maybe children's behaviour is changing, but I would like to think that school had a place in bridging that gap, in doing some supportive work, rather than just, you should know better, get out. But there
So
are
do you think the income do you think the income status of children's parents should be sort of recognized as a determiner of the behavior that they're capable of exhibiting?
No, because that's really stereotypical, isn't it? And really essentialising to say, actually, if you're a nice middle class kid, you're not going to have any problems with behaviour. If you've got a really challenging home life, you know, I'm going to have to treat you entirely differently. But the statistics about children's exclusion, formal exclusions, and sort of internal exclusions, we are disproportionately excluding children who have free school meals. So there is something happening to particular groups of children where they are significantly more at risk of being removed from school, either formally or informally.
So, okay, so in terms of I know the report mentioned 8.3% of pupils being isolated at least once a week. I think they looked at like 120 schools or something. Is that evidence of overuse, or could it just reflect schools using isolation effectively to protect learning?
I would want to come back to you and ask what you mean by effectively and what you mean by isolation. So again, we've got some real issues in terms of what I think about as isolation is going to be slightly different to what you think about as isolation. It's going to be slightly different to what that teacher listening to this thinks about as isolation. So it's not a well-defined term. And this is something that the report picks up on, and actually lots and lots of research picks up on, is that if you've got a child who's going to isolation and they're with a really well-qualified, supportive, knowledgeable adult, and they're doing some work around, okay, we need to pick up this academic work that you've missed, but also let's think about doing a bit of relationship development, a bit of kind of social skills. That's a form of isolation for a short period that I think, okay, that might be quite useful. But if you're talking about a child who's in isolation, who's in a booth where the windows are boarded up, so some of the young people that I've spoken to in some of my research were in isolation rooms for very prolonged period, days at a time, where the windows were boarded up. They didn't have break times with the rest of the school. They didn't have lunch times with the rest of the school. They were given work they couldn't access with an adult who was unable to help them with the work that they'd been told to do. So you've got two really different experiences of isolation. So it makes it really difficult for me to say whether isolation is being used appropriately or not, because there is no agreed understanding of what happens to a child when they're in isolation and how long the isolation is used for. So you're comparing completely different experiences. So some schools' isolation might be more akin to a nurture group, where they're doing some really great work together and come back to the classroom in a much better state to learn. Other isolation might make children feel deeply isolated in the true sense of the word, deeply alone. It might really impact negatively on relationships with their peers and their teachers, so they're going to come back in a very different state.
In terms of, the safety of staff and students, do you think that plays a part in the use of removal? I mean, do you feel like that's something that needs to be taken into account in terms of the environments you described there, and just being able to have a place where a student can be removed and placed for a period of time, for the just purely based on the safety of the teachers, the other students, and the learning in the classroom?
Yeah, and I don't think many people would argue with that. So if I think about my children going to school, if there is a violent incident in the classroom, then yes, I would want them to be safe and protected. But again, my thoughts, my concerns would be around what happened to that pupil when they were isolated. And is anybody supporting them? So if you've got a violent pupil, I don't think there are many children who go into school and think, right, I'm going to absolutely kick off. I'm going to have a really violent outburst. And there's absolutely nothing driving it. I just think I'm going to really hurt some people today. I think if you've got a child who's exhibiting violent behaviour, there is often a reason that is driving that. So if that child is removed and is working with another adult to re-regulate, to calm down, to think about repairing some of that damage from a kind of restorative perspective, so if there's some restorative conversations going on, if there's some work to help pick up the emotional pieces, then I think that removal is really valid and really important.
Do you
If
not
that
think
child is
that?
removed
Do you
and
not think
left
that
alone,
happens anyway, though? Do you not think that happens in the vast majority of schools anyway? What you just
in the
described.
vast majority of schools, there is evidence to suggest it can happen, but there is very little research around what happens when children are isolated and how long they're isolated for. So yeah, absolutely, that should happen, but I don't know from the research, from the statistics we've got, if it is always happening.
I didn't say always. I just said the vast
No,
majority.
yeah, and I don't
But
think there are
you
any.
don't think it is necessarily in
The
the
research,
vast.
there is no data to show what happens when children are isolated. So the small scale studies, there's this really big study here, but again, they're saying actually it's quite challenging to understand how schools are using isolation. And also in terms of staffing and budgets, I think there are some schools where there is a real crisis in terms of funding and staffing. And I wonder if children who are in these isolation rooms are always supported in the best way they can be. And I'm not making any kind of judgments on schools, because I think schools are generally trying to do the best they can do with what they've got. But I think for some schools, they're in a position where staffing is such an issue that maybe it's not always the perfect person in those rooms. And it also takes a really big emotional toll on the teachers or staff who are in those rooms. I've had some conversations with staff who've worked in isolation rooms who have found it really emotionally challenging. So it's not just the children who are being impacted by being isolated, it's also the staff who are working with those children.
Do you think, again, there'll be people out there who will say, Emma's calling for more support, one-to-one, therapeutic interventions, more restorative conversations, more, nurture projects, more sitting around in circles and doing things and everything else for students who've exhibited really poor behavior towards, staff and students and so on. Do you think there's that danger of sort of students seeing those things as a bit of a get out of jail free card, or a bit of a, not necessarily a reward, but I can kick off, I can be rude, I can do whatever I want in lessons, and if that happens, I come out, I have a conversation with Miss Clarke, we have a conversation where she asked me why I did what I did, and I said I'm going through a rough time, and I woke up on the wrong side of the bed this morning and last week, and I've not had much sleep in the last few weeks for whatever reason. And then Miss Clarke says, okay, what we'll do, we'll try and get you back in the class. But for now, if you just sit here and we can chat for an hour, and then, after that, I'll take you back to the class. We'll talk to your teacher. We'll have a conversation involving them, and then we'll bring you back into the classroom, and they look at that and go, this is all right, actually. This ain't bad. I might do this again in a few weeks, because you know what? I don't want to be in those lessons anyway. Right? Are we taking away a little? Are we seeing things a little bit, like it's Hogwarts, and all the kids are angelic, and they all want, the best for themselves and others, and and everything else. Do you think? What would you say to those people who are saying things like that?
I'd say, what's the alternative? So if we carry on isolating children, marginalising children, the statistics are really clear about what happens. So certainly this large-scale report that we're kind of talking around today shows that internal isolation is the first step to more formal sorts of exclusion from school. And the statistics when children are excluded from school are utterly harrowing. I mean, it's really damning. Children's life chances are hugely impacted by exclusion from school. 70% of young girls in the criminal justice.
Is that by exclusion, or is that by their own behaviours?
I think you're kind of confusing the two there. So it depends on, children are excluded for a range of different reasons, from a whole, from the kind of gamut of really violent behaviour to just consistent infringement. And children are also excluded informally. So it's not just you have got a permanent exclusion. Actually, if we're putting children in isolation rooms, if we are marginalising from the rest of the group, we're encouraging other forms of exclusion. So children begin to exclude themselves, they begin to truant, they begin to go off on long-term persistent absence. So we're starting to push children out of education, whether formally or informally. And again, the statistics around that are really, really interesting. But children's life chances, let's just say when they are not in school then, whether they've been permanently, formally excluded, or whether they've experienced a grey exclusion, are just really damning. So yeah, maybe it sounds really fluffy to say, oh, let's sit around and talk about our issues. But actually, for me, if that keeps a child in school for a little bit longer and gives us a little bit longer to try and re-engage them with lessons, to try and re-engage them with their teachers, to try and develop that sense of belonging, to try and make them feel part of a school community, to give them more capacity, more chances to get their GCSEs, then yeah, I would argue for that every time, rather than forcing a child out of school and understanding the implications of what happens to them when they leave school. So,
But when you say forcing them out of school,
yeah.
what do you mean by that?
So there are lots of children who are formally excluded who experience permanent exclusion from school. There are also a significantly greater number who experience grey exclusions, so who are encouraged by the school to join another school and never make it onto that role, who are off-rolled, so to use the kind of Ofsted terminology, who decide themselves that actually school is not for me, I am just not going to be in school, or actually I'm going to register in school but I'm not going to attend my lessons, I'm going to sit in the toilets, I'm going to get in the ceiling tiles up in the gaps between the floors, and I'm going to stay there for the rest of the day. Once children are not in our classrooms and are not actively part of our school community, once they are not within our care, then they experience a range of circumstances, a range of issues that are really, really negative. So for me, yeah, it might sound idealistic, but if it keeps children within the classroom context, then we can start to work with them. Once they are pushed out of that classroom context, either when they take those choices themselves because they have decided that education is not for them, being part of a school community is not for them, working with their peers is not for them, then we lose those chances. We lose that capacity to work with children in our care. And from my understanding, teachers, we don't go into the profession for the money and the holidays. We go into the profession to do the very best we can for the children that we've got in front of us. And for me, that means keeping those children in school for as long as possible.
Okay. In terms of, I keep sort of coming back to this, but are there viable alternatives that protect the learning of other students whilst avoiding the harm suggested by this research?
Yeah, but this research also suggested, really interestingly, from the data they collected, that schools that use exclusion rooms or removal in some form to keep other learners safe, which I know is one of the main sort of thrusts from other people in terms of the advocacy of isolation rooms. The report suggests that actually there isn't an impact on other people's learning if isolation rooms are used really commonly or really, really rarely. So I think that is an assumption, and I can understand why we would assume that, but it doesn't seem to be borne out by the data that actually it has this significant impact.
Okay, just anecdotally though, we've got a host on TTR actually called Ray, and she was talking just a couple of weeks ago, and she was saying that in her school they've introduced, first warning, second warning, and then you're removed from the lesson and so on, and member of SLT will come and pick up the student and so on, and off they go. That's massively improved her ability to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea that it doesn't matter whether students are removed or not from lessons and how quickly they are, I'm surprised at that personally.
I'm surprised.
Because fundamentally, as a teacher of nearly 20 years, if I'm not able to remove a student from my lesson for whatever it is, then that's going to create difficulties for me. And that's where there'll be many out there watching this worried, Emma, maybe about your approach, in the sense of there's a lot of focus in the conversation on the individuals who are choosing to and I know that the word choosing doesn't apply to every single student, right? But there is a large chunk of students that it does apply to. There is also the idea that in a school, how many opportunities does a child get to change their behavior? And I would argue, and I think others would argue, quite a lot. In a lesson, a lot of schools now have 3 warnings, even 4 warnings. They have a myriad of interventions. And then even after those 4 warnings, there's an opportunity to then, almost triage and then come back into the class and not go through to it, depending on what happens in that situation. Or they're spoken to outside the classroom and then they're brought back in and then they go to removal, but they only go to removal for a little bit of time. Then they're back in circulation. If they do it again, we start again, right? So there'll be people looking at that going, blimey heck, there's a lot of opportunities here. But I wondered on that point of what Ray was saying about her experience of her school and, really tightening it up. I'm sure, I don't know this for a fact, there'll be schools out there like Ray's where their internal, removal rates and even maybe their external exclusion rates could be higher. But as a teacher, she's saying she can do her job better. And yeah, I wondered what you would say to her.
I think so. I was surprised by that finding in the data because it would seem automatic, wouldn't it? Actually, that if you've got children who are challenging your capacity to teach, and they're removed, that it would improve the learning outcomes of everybody else. So that would be a really interesting piece of data to follow up and look at the reasons why. Now, I didn't do this study, so I can't talk about why. And I think, again, what makes it really challenging is schools have got really different contexts, haven't they? And I think I'm not suggesting all schools do a certain thing. What I'm saying is, as an education system, what we are all doing isn't working. Now, Ray's school might be doing something brilliant and they might have absolutely top strategies for working with those children who have been removed, for doing some really great kind of repair and reintegration work, bringing them back in. They might have a cracking pastoral system that works really, really well for the children they've got in their care, which supports the teachers to teach, which supports the children to learn. I'm not in a position to say, whoa, no, don't do that. That's not right. It's really context-based. But as a whole, our rates as an English education system, which is not mirrored in the other 4 nations, our exclusion rates, both grey exclusions and formal exclusions, are astronomical. And what this report is suggesting is that internal isolation is the first step on the ladder to becoming more formally excluded from school. So I'm not in any position to critique any individual school's approach. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. And there are loads of schools doing loads of amazing stuff, which is absolutely brilliant. But if you look at England's statistics compared to Scotland, compared to Wales, compared to Northern Ireland, we are an anomaly, a huge anomaly. We really stand out within the system. So what I'm saying is English education systems as a whole, not an individual school's approach, what we are doing as a whole is not working. It is not supporting the children in our care. Isolation rooms are part of that picture, I would argue, but as are lots and lots and lots of other things. So if Ray's school has got a system that works, that is supporting the children in their care, that is reducing long-term marginalisation and long-term exclusion, brilliant, go for it, do more of it. But that's not the case in every school, otherwise the statistics would not be the frightening state that they are.
Do you think that there's a lot more focus? We have some students in schools who are causing really sort of, whether intentionally or unintentionally, they are damaging the education of all the students every single day in classrooms around the country. That's happening. Do you think that the focus, the funding, the support, these conversations focus too much on those students rather than the majority of students who sort of get on with it, get their head down, they do what they're supposed to do, they are the majority of the time respectful, they cooperate, they follow the rules. They do everything they're supposed to be doing. They might be quite quiet, but they get on with it. Do you think that there's too much focus on particular groups, and we don't spend enough time thinking about maybe the majority of students who don't get anywhere near as much, attention?
That's a really interesting question. And I think the word attention is really interesting. So yes, there is a lot of discussion and attention around those children who are in need and who are in crisis, compared to those kids who, like say,
but why you I just want to pick up there, in need and in crisis. So you're saying that every student in that group I just described,
back up. No, I'm not saying every student. I haven't used the word every, and I'm being
no, but it's just you
really
associated that with that, and that's where I picked up on it, because your immediate thing was in need and in crisis. I'm just saying, in my personal teaching experience, a lot of the students who've ended up, getting, the most attentions, being removed from classrooms, or being internally excluded, or being even externally excluded, there are a big proportion of those that weren't necessarily in crisis. They were just exhibiting really poor behaviors really consistently, and then the school had no choice. That's my experience of it. But anyway, go on. I know you weren't saying that was the only thing, but you mentioned in crisis and so on. So that's where.
So I'm coming from a particular perspective, thinking about the children that I've worked with and the research that I've done with young people. And for me, from my personal experience, not essentializing to all schools and all teachers, from my personal experience, the children that I worked with who exhibited the most challenging behaviour were the children who had the most need, and quite often when there was a really significant incident, were at a point of crisis.
Okay.
I'm not saying that is the case for every child, but that's my experience of working with the children that I've worked with, and also the research with the young people that I've worked with. Most of them had talked about wider significant issues in their life, which were a driver of their behaviour. So that's my kind of perspective, because that's my understanding. And also, I've forgotten your question, but I'm going to come back to it in a second. And also, when we look at the stats of children who are excluded, we're disproportionately excluding children who've got a SEND need. So again, for me, the statistics and my experience, and I'm talking from a personal perspective and from a kind of statistical perspective, are suggesting that actually the children who get the most attention, was the word that you used, are those with high level of need. So the kind of statistics are telling a different, not a different story, but are giving a different angle on it, because we are disproportionately excluding children with SEND. So when you talk about attention, yes, these children get a lot of discussion. There is a lot of narrative about it. There is a lot of research around it. But in terms of attention, I wonder if that attention would be better provided by additional funding. So yes, we talk about it a lot, but that doesn't mean we're not also thinking about our learners who just get their heads down and crack on. So yes, I think there should be attention, but I think that attention should come with funding, should come with extra resourcing, should come with extra support. And also, if I think about the needs of those children who are causing some of these issues, who like you suggest, are impacting on other children's learning, I wonder actually if the education system was more supportive for the children who had those needs, whether that would also be beneficial for all of our children. So if we think about a kind of quality first teaching model, actually if we're supporting those children who have got who need attention, however you want to frame it, is that also going to be beneficial for all of our learners? So again, I'm coming from a kind of really big perspective, and I'm not saying all children, all schools, all teachers, but I'm looking at individual case studies of pupils from research. I'm looking at wider research, but you can't argue with those statistics. You know, our statistics for losing children from school, both just disappearing off roll and nobody knowing where they are, and permanently excluding, is disproportionate compared to the other UK nations, which suggests to me we've got an issue.
Last question, Emma, because we're running out of time. What would be the minimum acceptable standards for an isolation room if you were setting national guidelines for a removal or isolation room?
I would not like to set a minimum standard because I think it's really context dependent. And I think it's really individual dependent. So I don't know necessarily if we're talking minimum standards, but and the report also suggests what we need is further clarity around how long, what are they going to do there, and who are they going to be with. I think if you say, do this, and you're in isolation, I think you run up against a lot of issues there. It takes away your agency as a teacher to think, actually, for this child, this is a really, really worrying behaviour that I'm struggling to manage in the classroom. Whereas for another child, you might think, actually, when I do these two things, that's going to really de-escalate it and they're going to be all right. Or it's a Monday morning, they've had a catastrophic weekend. If I just hang on for another 5 minutes, I know that it'll get better and we can just crack on then.
What do you think the single most important message from this report, should be for sort of teachers and school leaders to take away?
This report suggests, and I would absolutely agree, that we need to rethink the use of isolation rooms and think really carefully about the purpose that they're serving and the impact they have on the children that are in them.
Emma, thank you ever so much for your time. It's been really good to speak to you. And we'll look forward to more chats in the future.
Thank you very much.
Take care. See you soon.
Thank you.
Right, that is it from us for this show on TTR2. Great interviews, really interesting talking points. Again, I would love to hear your points of view on them. Do send them in, do share them on social media. Drop me a line if you want as well, so we can follow up on this conversation. It's been interesting. So removal rooms, isolation rooms, I'm sure the debate will rumble on. It won't go away, and we'll be here for it. So I will see you in about, right now actually, because I am moving on with a show on coaching walkthroughs, which begins imminently. So I'll see you there.
Outstanding, a world-class vision, a world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people. I
just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused.